3 days before my daughter's wedding, I was standing beside a paper cutter when Helen Mercer called and told me my wife was sleeping with her husband. It was Wednesday morning, a little after 9. Grant Print and Graphics was busy with regular client work and the last few pieces for Emily's wedding. One of my employees was trimming welcome cards while I checked the seating display proof. My phone rang from a number I did not recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail. That morning, I answered, because half our family seemed to be calling from borrowed phones, hotels, airports, or somebody else's car. A woman asked if this was Michael Grant. When I said yes, she paused before introducing herself. My name is Helen Mercer. I knew the name immediately. Tom Mercer and I had known each other for more than a decade. He was not my closest friend, but our families had eaten together, celebrated birthdays, and spent enough holidays in the same rooms that Emily had grown up thinking of Tom and Helen as part of our wider family circle. I stepped away from the cutter. Of course, is everything all right? No, she said. I need you to listen before you decide I'm crazy or hang up on me. Her voice was controlled, but only just. I walked into my office and closed the door. What happened? Rebecca has been sleeping with Tom. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. Through the glass wall, somebody carried a stack of Emily's wedding cards past my office. Helen's sentence felt completely disconnected from the room around me. I asked her to say it again, and she did. This is not me guessing, she added. I have seen enough to know what I'm telling you is true. My first instinct was not to believe her. Tom and Helen had been married a long time, and an ugly fight between them was still easier for me to accept than what she was saying. Helen, if you and Tom are having problems, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to accuse Rebecca because I knew you were going to say that. I would too, she said, sounding tired rather than offended. I'm sending you 2 things. Look at them before you call her. My phone vibrated while we were still talking. The first image was a photograph of Tom and Rebecca sitting in a curved restaurant booth. It looked like a selfie Tom had taken from slightly above the table. Rebecca was pressed against his shoulder, one hand resting high on his chest. Tom's face was turned toward hers instead of the camera. It was not graphic. It looked comfortable. Which was worse. The image was dated 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday night. I stared at it until Helen asked whether I was still there. I'm here. The second image was a screenshot from a message thread. Most of the conversation had been cropped out. Helen had not sent me pages of private messages, just enough to show the names in one exchange. Tom had written that he hated squeezing everything into short windows. Rebecca's answer read, "Get through Saturday first. Then we can figure out what this actually is when nobody needs me every 5 minutes." Saturday was Emily's wedding, and I sat down. Where did you get these? Helen said Tom had left an iPad at home that still received messages from his phone. A notification from Rebecca led her to the thread and the synced photograph. She had waited to confront him because she wanted to know whether she was seeing one bad conversation or something larger. How long have you known that something was wrong? A couple of weeks that it was Rebecca. 4 days. Then why call me now? Her breathing changed. Because yesterday Tom asked me what time we should leave for Emily's wedding. He was still planning to put on a suit, stand in front of you, hug your daughter, and act like he was one of your family friends. I did not have an answer to that. Helen continued. I spent 2 days telling myself I could wait until after the wedding, because none of this is Emily's fault. Then I realized that waiting means letting the two of them decide what everybody else is allowed to know. I looked at the photograph again, especially the date. 3 weeks earlier, Rebecca and I had planned dinner in Brentwood. She canceled a few hours beforehand because, she said, Emily needed help with the florist. I remembered the night because I ended up eating takeout alone. The restaurant in Helen's photograph was more than half an hour from the area where Rebecca had said she was helping Emily. I asked Helen whether Tom knew she had called me. Does he know you found the messages? I think he knows I'm suspicious. He does not know what I saw. I asked what she wanted me to do. I don't know yet, Helen said after a pause. I wanted you to know before Saturday. What you do with Rebecca is your decision. The fact that she did not arrive with a plan for me made the call feel more credible, not less. Before we hung up, she said one more thing. I'm angry enough right now that I don't trust myself around either of them. So if I sound unstable, that's why, but I am not lying to you. After the call ended, I sat alone in my office with my daughter's wedding seating display visible through the glass. 3 days from now, Tom Mercer was supposed to sit among our friends and family, while Rebecca stood beside me as the mother of the bride. But I knew what she had told me on that Tuesday night, and I knew where she had actually been. I did not call Rebecca or Emily from the office. Helen had shown me enough to take seriously, but not enough to drop the accusation into my daughter's life without checking what I could check myself. I tried to keep working and failed at it. After rereading the same customer email several times, I handed the final wedding work to my production manager and left early. Before I made it out of the shop, Emily texted me. "Dad, what time are you getting to the venue Saturday?" "Daniel says 12:30, but Mom says noon." I stared at the message for a long time. Nothing in the message was unusual. Emily was still worrying about timing, flowers, photographs, and whether her father would arrive exactly when instructed. I texted back that I would be there by noon. Then I drove home. Rebecca was not home yet. I looked at Helen's screenshots once more, then put my phone down. What I needed was something Rebecca herself could answer. She came home a little after 5 carrying 2 garment bags and a cardboard box from the wedding venue. "You're home early," she said. "I got what I needed done." She put the box on the dining table. "Good. Maybe you can help me figure out how we're getting all of this to the venue without crushing anything." For the next 20 minutes, she talked about seating changes, a missed flight connection, and another change to the venue schedule. Watching her handle the same ordinary family details, she always had made the photograph on my phone feel even more unreal. I waited until we were both in the kitchen. "Do you remember that Tuesday a few weeks ago when we were supposed to go to Brentwood?" Rebecca opened the refrigerator. "Which Tuesday?" "The night you canceled, because Emily needed help." She thought for a second, and asked if I meant the florist problem. That's what I remembered. Yeah, they had changed part of the table design and Emily was getting stressed about it. She took out a bottle of water. "What about it?" Part of me still wanted her to tell me I had the date wrong, or remind me of another Tuesday I had confused with this one. Instead, Rebecca repeated the lie without hesitation. I asked where she and Emily had met. Rebecca said they had gone over some options near the venue, and then stopped for coffee. She was still talking when I realized I no longer needed to test anything else. The photograph Helen sent showed Rebecca with Tom at a restaurant more than half an hour away. I had my own answer now. I did not confront her in the kitchen. I wanted a few minutes to decide what the first conversation was actually about, instead of spending the night arguing over dates. I told Rebecca I was tired and went upstairs. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and called Helen back. I asked her about the night in the photo. She repeated the same story she told me 3 weeks ago. Helen was quiet for a moment before saying, "I'm sorry." I asked whether she had anything showing when the relationship started. "Not exactly. The messages I saw go back months, but I haven't read every conversation, and I'm not going to pretend I have a clean timeline." That was the right answer. She did tell me that one of the older threads referred to a dinner from the previous fall in a way that made it obvious the relationship was already personal then. That was enough to tell me this was not a bad decision from last weekend. I asked if Tom had said anything about Rebecca leaving me. Helen paused before answering. "He talks like the wedding is some kind of line they're waiting to cross. I don't know what she actually promised him." That distinction mattered, because the message she had shown me said they would figure things out after Saturday. It did not say Rebecca had promised to file for divorce on Sunday. I thanked Helen and ended the call. Downstairs, Rebecca was on the phone with Emily discussing the rehearsal dinner. I could hear her laughing. That sound did something to me the photograph had not. Rebecca had been mixing real family responsibilities with lies that let her move around unnoticed. The wedding was not merely happening alongside the affair. At least sometimes, she had used it as cover. I waited until she finished the call. Then I went downstairs and told her we needed to talk before either of us went to bed. Rebecca looked at my face and stopped gathering things from the dining table. "What happened?" I pulled out a chair but did not sit. "Helen Mercer called me this morning." Rebecca went completely still. I had expected confusion or denial. Instead, the silence told me enough. "And part of a conversation between the two of you." Rebecca closed her eyes and asked how much Helen had sent. "Enough to know what is happening." She sat down, and after a long silence said, "I'm sorry." Her reaction was quieter than I expected. She did not reach for me. She looked like somebody who had spent months fearing this moment, and had finally run out of ways to delay it. "I know that probably means nothing to you right now." I asked how long it had been going on. Rebecca rubbed both hands over her face, tried to slow the conversation down, and finally admitted it. About 10 months. I asked whether Tom was the reason some of her late real estate appointments had stretched so long. She admitted that some of those late appointments had been cover. When I brought up the Tuesday she had blamed on Emily and the florist, her face changed and she admitted that one too. How many times did you use her? Rebecca winced at the wording, but I told her I did not know another honest way to describe it. She stood and started pacing beside the table. Most of the wedding things I told you about were real. I was at the fittings and the venue meetings, and I did help her with the florist. But there were a few times when I said I was doing something for the wedding, and I wasn't. I told her that was still using Emily as cover. Rebecca said she knew, her voice breaking, and stopped pacing when I sat down. This was not supposed to keep going this long, she said. I kept thinking I was going to end it, and then the wedding got closer and everything got more complicated. I told her the wedding had not made her sleep with Tom, and asked her not to use the calendar as an explanation for what she had chosen. She nodded, looked down at the table, and started crying. It did not make me feel better. She said she and Tom had started talking more after a dinner with friends the previous fall. He complained about his marriage. She talked about how predictable our life had become. Lunches became drinks. And eventually the relationship crossed a line. I listened, because after 29 years I still wanted to understand what had happened, even though understanding would not make it smaller. When she finished, I asked the question that had been sitting under everything else. I asked what was supposed to happen after Saturday, and told her Helen had shown me the message about waiting until the wedding was over. I told him I was not making any decisions before the wedding, Rebecca said. That is not the same as telling him nothing is going to happen after it. She hesitated, and that was enough. She admitted Tom wanted her to leave me. She had refused to promise that she would, but every time he pushed, she told him they could not have that conversation until after Emily was married. I told her Tom clearly thought Saturday meant something. Rebecca said she had never promised to leave me, but she could not deny that she had let him keep waiting for a decision after the wedding. Michael, I know what I did to you is terrible, and I know we have to deal with it, but Emily cannot know this right now. The wedding moved to the center of the conversation exactly as I had feared. Whatever you want to do after Saturday, I'll deal with it, Rebecca said. If you want me out of the house or you want to call a lawyer, I understand. But people are already flying in. The rehearsal is Friday, and Emily is barely sleeping as it is. You cannot drop this on her 3 days before she gets married. Part of what Rebecca said was true. Emily had done nothing wrong, and I did not want her walking into a rehearsal dinner, wondering whether her parents were divorcing. Rebecca knew that was exactly where I would hesitate. I told her that waiting until Sunday meant pretending, while Tom remained an invited family friend. We can deal with Tom privately, Rebecca said. We can decide what happens in this house. We do not get to decide that Emily has to welcome him at her wedding without knowing why his presence matters. She does not need every adult mistake we make. She needs enough information to decide who is at her wedding. Fear replaced some of the shame in her face. I told her Tom would not be coming to any private family event we controlled from that moment forward. The wedding itself belongs to Emily and Daniel. I'm not canceling somebody else's guest. They decide that. Rebecca stood again. If you tell her tonight, you need to understand what you're doing. 10 years from now, when she remembers the 3 days before her wedding, she may remember that her father chose that moment to tell her. That landed exactly where Rebecca intended it to. I had been the person who postponed a fight when a holiday, an exam, a move, or one of Emily's important moments made the timing worse. I believe there was a difference between avoiding a problem and choosing a better time to solve it. Rebecca had lived with that habit for 29 years, and suddenly I understood that she had been depending on it. You knew I would wait, I said. She started to deny it, then stopped. I knew you would protect Emily, and that made this week safer for you. Rebecca had no answer for that. When she asked what I planned to tell Emily, I said I would keep it to the minimum. The affair had lasted months. Helen knew. Tom was still invited, and whether he remained invited belonged to Emily and Daniel. I told her I was not giving Emily screenshots or a catalog of lies, and I was not asking our daughter to decide whether her parents stayed married. I only wanted Emily to have enough truth to decide whether Tom still belonged at her wedding. Rebecca asked me to wait until morning, but I refused. We tell her tonight. You can come with me and tell the truth, or I can go alone, but this does not wait until after the wedding. Rebecca stared at the table for almost a minute. Then she wiped her face, picked up her phone, and said quietly, "I'm coming with you." Emily and Daniel lived about 15 minutes from us in a townhouse they had bought the year before. Rebecca sat beside me during the drive there, holding her phone in both hands and staring through the windshield. Twice she started to say something and stopped. The third time, she asked me not to make Tom the first thing Emily heard. "I'm not trying to make him the center of this," I said. "I'm telling her why this cannot wait until after Saturday." Rebecca nodded, but a minute later she tried another version. "Could we at least tell her we have a serious marriage problem and deal with the names after the wedding? Number Tom is still on her guest list. That is the reason she needs to know tonight." She looked away again. Emily opened the door wearing sweatpants and one of Daniel's old college t-shirts. There were boxes of wedding favors stacked along the wall behind her and a half-finished handwritten list on the kitchen counter. She smiled when she saw us, then looked from my face to Rebecca's. "What happened?" Daniel came out of the kitchen with 2 mugs in his hands and stopped when he saw us standing in the doorway. "I told Emily we needed to talk somewhere private and that the wedding was not being canceled." I said that first because I could see the thought forming on her face before she asked. We sat in the living room. Rebecca took the end of the sofa. I sat in the chair across from her, and Emily and Daniel sat together. For a few seconds, nobody knew how to begin. Rebecca finally said she had done something that was going to hurt Emily and had already hurt me. When Emily asked what she meant, Rebecca looked at me once and then forced herself to say it clearly. "I have been having an affair with Tom Mercer." Emily stared at her mother without raising her voice. She looked as though someone had given her a sentence in a language she understood word by word, but could not make sense of as a whole. "Tom Mercer, the Tom who is coming Saturday." Rebecca nodded. Daniel put his hand over Emily's. When Emily asked how I knew, I told her Helen had found messages and a photograph, and that Rebecca had admitted the relationship after I checked one of the dates. Emily turned back to her mother. "How long?" "About 10 months, Rebecca said. That was when Emily stood up. She walked toward the kitchen, stopped before she reached it, and turned around. 10 months means this was happening before we sent the invitations." Rebecca nodded. "And you were still going to let him come?" "I was trying to get through the wedding without doing this to you." Emily laughed once, but there was nothing amused in it. "You were trying not to do this to me." And Emily shook her head. "No, I don't think you do." Daniel asked if Emily wanted a minute alone. She shook her head and sat down again, this time nearer him than her mother. I reminded her that she did not need every detail or any responsibility for our marriage. The only decision that could not reasonably wait was whether Tom still belonged at her wedding. Emily asked whether I wanted her to uninvite him. "I want you and Daniel to decide for yourselves. If you keep him on the guest list, I will not turn your wedding into a scene. If you do not want him there, you should not feel obligated to keep him because of me or your mother." Daniel put the practical question into words. "If he shows up Saturday, are we all supposed to act like he is still a family friend?" Emily pressed both palms against her eyes. Rebecca leaned forward. "Emily, I am so sorry." Emily lowered her hands. "I need you to answer something first. Dad said there was a date you lied about. Did you use wedding stuff to see him?" Rebecca hesitated. I had hoped that part could wait, but there was no honest way around the question once Emily asked it. Rebecca said that most of the appointments and errands had been real, but there had been a few times when she had claimed she was helping with the wedding and had actually been with Tom. Emily's voice became quieter. When Emily asked which times, Rebecca tried to tell her she did not need to go through every date that night. "I need to know whether I was actually there," Emily said. Rebecca looked at me as if she wanted help getting out of the question. I did not give it. She admitted. She admitted the Tuesday she had used as an excuse to cancel dinner with me. She also admitted there had been 2 other evenings when she had said wedding planning was taking longer than it really was. Emily stared at the floor and said she had kept apologizing for taking up so much of her mother's time. Rebecca began crying and told her she had wanted to help with the wedding. Emily finally looked up. "Then why use me as the excuse?" Rebecca had no clean answer. Daniel stood and asked if we could give them a little space. I agreed. Rebecca started to get up too, but Emily asked her to stay. Daniel and I went into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter and asked whether there was any realistic chance this was a misunderstanding. "Number." I'm not asking because I don't believe you, Daniel said. I just needed to know how solid this is before we start making decisions. I told him it was solid. He looked toward the living room. This is her wedding, and I will support whatever she wants. But I do not want Tom there. I also do not know what we do about Helen. Neither do I. She is the one who told me. Daniel rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. I feel like we should be discussing table assignments, and now I'm trying to figure out which adults can safely sit in the same building. I'm sorry. You did not cause this. We stayed in the kitchen until Emily called us back. Her eyes were red. Rebecca looked worse. Emily said she wanted a few minutes alone with Daniel before deciding anything about Tom. She asked Rebecca and me to go home. Rebecca tried to ask whether she could call later. Emily said, "Not tonight." The words were quiet rather than cruel, which somehow made them harder for Rebecca to hear. Rebecca nodded. Before we left, Emily stopped me at the door and asked me not to tell anyone else that night. Not Aunt Carol, not Grandma, not any of the relatives coming into town. I cannot have everybody looking at me like they know something. I understand. I won't tell anyone. She hugged me briefly, then stepped back without hugging Rebecca. On the drive home, Rebecca cried quietly beside me. Halfway there, she said Emily hated her. She is hurt, I said. That is not the same thing. Rebecca wiped her face and repeated that she had been trying to protect the weak. I did not answer because we had already had that argument. 20 minutes after we got home, Emily texted both of us. Daniel and I talked. Tom is not coming to the rehearsal dinner or the wedding. Rebecca read the message beside me at the kitchen table. For the first time since Helen's call, the person whose wedding was at stake had made a decision about what happened next. And it was the person whose wedding they had all been using as the reason to wait. I barely slept Wednesday night. Rebecca stayed in our bedroom. I took the guest room. At 6:30 Thursday morning, I heard Rebecca's phone ringing through the wall. A few minutes later, she came downstairs while I was making coffee and told me Tom knew. Emily had called him the night before, told him he was no longer invited to either the rehearsal dinner or the wedding, and asked him not to contact her again before Saturday. Rebecca said he had taken it badly and then admitted he had called her as soon as Emily hung up. He wanted to know what I told you and why Emily knows. I sat across from her and asked what she had told him, that it was not my decision to tell Emily. The answer irritated me, but I let her continue. Tom thought I had told Emily to punish them, and he wanted to know what Rebecca intended to do after Saturday. I told him I am not discussing our future, while my daughter is 2 days from getting married. There it was again. Another decision moved to the far side of the wedding. I almost pointed out that she was still doing exactly what she had done for months, moving every decision to the other side of the wedding. Then, my phone rang, and Tom Mercer's name appeared on the screen. I looked at Rebecca. "Do you want me to let it go?" "No," she said. "I think you should answer." I took the call in my office at home and closed the door. Tom began by saying he knew nothing he said could make the affair acceptable, but he had called about Emily. She should never have been pulled into this 2 days before her wedding. "You were planning to attend that wedding as someone she trusted," I said. "That is why she needed enough truth to decide whether you still belonged there." Tom said he was not asking to be invited back. Emily had made her decision clear. What he wanted was for me to stop letting the affair spread through the family until after Saturday. The familiarity of the request was almost impressive. I told him I had not contacted his friends, relatives, or wedding guests. I had told my daughter the minimum, because the secret directly affected her guest list. Tom tried to shift the conversation toward Helen, saying she was furious and not thinking clearly. I told him whatever was happening between them was his problem. Helen had contacted me because he was still planning to attend my daughter's wedding, as if nothing had changed. That left him quiet. I asked what Rebecca had actually told him would happen after the wedding. Tom's tone changed. "She said we would figure things out." When I asked whether she had explicitly promised to leave me, he admitted she had only said she would not make decisions until Emily was married. That matched Rebecca's version closely enough to matter. Then Tom added, "You do not say that for 10 months unless you expect something to change." That was the gap between their versions. Rebecca had treated the wedding as permission not to decide, while Tom had treated it as a deadline. I asked whether he had ever considered what it would look like to sit at Emily's wedding beside Helen while Rebecca stood with me. Tom said he knew it was a bad situation, but he had no answer. When I reminded him that he had still asked Helen what time they should leave for the venue, I did not threaten him. I simply told him Emily had made her decision, and I expected him to respect it. Before we ended the call, Tom said he had never wanted to hurt Emily and asked whether he and Rebecca were supposed to blow up the wedding themselves. Number, you were supposed to stop sleeping with my wife. That was the sharpest thing I said to him. After the call, I sat in the office for a few minutes and realized it had given me less satisfaction than I expected. Tom did not sound like a man celebrating what he had done. He sounded like someone whose private arrangement had stopped obeying the rules he thought it had. Rebecca was still at the kitchen table when I came out. What did he say? He thinks telling Emily was an escalation. He also thinks the two of you are going to figure out your future after the wedding. Rebecca closed her eyes. Rebecca repeated that she had never promised Tom she was leaving me. I believe you never used those exact words, I said. She looked at me. That is not the same as believing me. Number, it isn't. Later that morning, Emily called, sounding steadier. Daniel had already told the venue coordinator Tom was off the list. They were not announcing a reason. If anyone asked, they would say Tom had a family situation. Tom and Helen had been invited to both the rehearsal dinner and the wedding because they had been in our family circle for years. Emily admitted she did not know whether she wanted Helen at either event now, even though Helen had done nothing wrong. You do not have to decide for her today, I said. She may not want to come. Emily was quiet for a moment. Emily mentioned that Rebecca had already texted her 3 times that morning. I offered to tell her to stop, but Emily shook that off. I will handle Mom. That answer reminded me again that Emily was 27, not a child I could organize around. Before she hung up, she said she still wanted the rehearsal dinner Friday to happen exactly as planned. Emily said she could not spend the next 2 days explaining why 2 guests had disappeared. I promised she would not have to because I was not telling anyone, and she thanked me before we hung up. When the call ended, I went back to the print shop. Work helped for about an hour. Then Helen called. Helen called as soon as I was back at the shop and asked whether it was true that Tom had been uninvited. I told her Emily and Daniel had made the decision the night before after Rebecca, and I told them the truth. Helen's next point came out as a statement, rather than a question. Rebecca was still going to the wedding. She is Emily's mother. Helen let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Of course she is. I knew immediately where the conversation was going. Helen told me she had spent the last several days sitting in her house with messages between Tom and Rebecca. Meanwhile, Rebecca still got to attend the rehearsal dinner, stand beside Emily, and look to everyone else, like she was having the best weekend of her life. I told her the weekend would not feel that way to Rebecca, but I understood what she meant. Then Helen said, I want to see her. When she said she wanted to see Rebecca at the rehearsal dinner the next night, my stomach tightened. The rehearsal dinner is not the place. I was invited, Michael. I did not sleep with anybody's husband. So why am I the one who is supposed to disappear? There was no answer that made the situation fair. I told her that if she wanted to confront Rebecca after the wedding, I would understand. Friday night, however, would be full of people who had nothing to do with the affair, and Emily had specifically asked not to become the subject of everyone's whispers. You called me because you thought I deserved the truth, and I am grateful you did, I said. Emily did not do anything to either of us. Please do not make her rehearsal dinner the place where this becomes public. Helen accused me of protecting Rebecca. I'm protecting Emily's wedding from becoming about Rebecca. I know that makes the next 2 days easier for my wife too, and I hate that part, but I cannot make Emily pay for it just to make things less convenient for Rebecca. Helen said I still got to stand beside my daughter. Rebecca still got to stand beside her, while Helen was expected to sit at home and wonder whether Tom was calling Rebecca. I am not telling you that is fair, I said. I'm saying fairness between the 4 of us is not the only thing that matters for the next 48 hours. She ended the call without telling me what she had decided. I called Rebecca and told her Helen was considering going to the rehearsal dinner. Panic entered her voice immediately, and she insisted I had to stop it. I told her I think it is the wrong place, but I cannot control her. Rebecca wanted me to call again and make sure Helen understood. She understands. She is also an adult whose husband has been cheating on her. I do not get to order her around because you are afraid of what she might say. Rebecca said that if Helen walked into the dinner and started telling people, Emily might never forgive her. This is what happens when more people learn the truth, I said. You lose control over what they do with it. She then asked whether I was sure Tom would stay away. I told her Emily had removed him from the guest list, and that I was not going to spend the weekend managing Tom for her. The rest of Thursday passed without another confrontation, which only made the countdown more noticeable. Relatives were arriving in town. Daniel's father needed a box brought to the rehearsal, and Emily sent another revised wedding timeline. Rebecca and I moved through the evening on separate tracks. She packed clothes for the venue and made 2 calls to vendors. I put the finished welcome cards in the back of my SUV and checked that the framed seating display was wrapped securely. We did not discuss our marriage. We were still functioning as the parents of the bride, while both of us knew the marriage underneath that role might already be over. Friday morning, Emily asked us to meet her at the venue before noon. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for 6:30 that evening. I still had not heard from Helen. By lunch, Rebecca had asked twice whether Helen's silence meant she had decided not to come. I told her I did not know and refused to keep checking. I am not going to monitor her so you can feel safer. Rebecca insisted this was about protecting Emily, but even she did not sound convinced that was the whole reason. At the venue, Emily was busy enough that there was no room for another family discussion. She moved between the coordinator, Daniel, and the wedding party with a clipboard in her hand. When Rebecca approached to help, Emily gave her a task involving welcome bags and then went in the other direction. The distance between them was subtle enough that nobody else seemed to notice. But I did. Around 4. My phone vibrated while I was carrying a box from the parking area. I expected Helen, but it was my sister asking where she should sit at dinner. By 6, guests began arriving at the restaurant where the rehearsal dinner was being held. Rebecca stood near the entrance greeting people with me, because that was what we had planned months earlier. She smiled when relatives approached, accepted hugs, and answered ordinary questions about the wedding. Every time the door opened, her eyes moved toward it. Mine did too. Tom was not coming. Emily had made that decision. Helen was different. She had done nothing wrong to lose her invitation, and I had no authority to remove her simply because I was afraid of what she might say. All I could do was hope she still believed Emily should not pay for what Rebecca and Tom had done. At 6:25, the door opened again. I looked up before I could stop myself. It was Daniel's aunt and uncle. 5 minutes remained before dinner was supposed to begin. I still did not know whether Helen Mercer was coming. At 6:30, the restaurant staff closed the doors to the private room and began directing people toward their tables. Helen had not appeared, although I still did not know whether she had decided to stay home or was simply late. Rebecca and I moved away from the entrance and took our seats at the family table. Emily sat between Daniel and one of her bridesmaids. She spoke to Rebecca when she needed to, but the ease that had always existed between them was gone. Nobody else seemed to notice because there were too many people talking at once and too many reasons for the bride to look distracted the night before her wedding. About 10 minutes into dinner, one of our longtime friends leaned toward me. "Where are Tom and Helen?" I thought they were coming. Before I could answer, Rebecca said, "They had a family situation come up." The words were technically true. Our friend nodded sympathetically and moved on to another subject. I looked at Rebecca. She kept her eyes on her plate. For months, she had used Emily's wedding as an explanation for where she was going. Now she was using a vague family problem to explain why the man she had been seeing was no longer welcome at the wedding. I did not point out the irony, because there was nothing useful in making her feel it more sharply in that room, and dinner moved on. Daniel's father gave a short toast. Emily laughed at something one of her bridesmaids said. My sister complained that she had already cried twice that day and blamed the champagne. To everyone else, it looked like the evening we had planned, while inside our family every ordinary moment carried a second meaning. When the photographer gathered the immediate family for a few informal pictures, Rebecca came to stand beside me out of habit. She rested her hand lightly against my back. I stepped half a pace toward Emily instead. I did not make a show of moving away from Rebecca, and the photographer did not notice anything unusual. We took the picture with Emily and Daniel between us. Then the photographer asked for one of just the bride and her parents. Rebecca moved closer again. I stood where I was, close enough for the photograph to look normal, but not close enough to perform a marriage we were no longer discussing. Honestly, Emily noticed the distance. Her eyes met mine for less than a second before she looked back at the camera. Later, Rebecca followed me into the hallway outside the private room and asked whether I planned to keep my distance in every photograph the next day. I stood next to you tonight. You know what I mean. You acted like being close to me was some kind of betrayal. I understood exactly what she meant. You asked me not to destroy Emily's wedding. I agreed with that. You did not get an agreement that I would pretend nothing happened. Rebecca folded her arms. Rebecca reminded me there would be family pictures the next day. I told her I would be in them, and when she asked what I would do if the photographer put us together, I gave her the only promise I could honestly make. I will stand next to you. I am not going to embarrass Emily over a photograph. That seemed to calm her slightly. Rebecca then asked whether I had heard from Helen. When I said no, she glanced toward the entrance and suggested that maybe Helen had decided not to come. Maybe, I said, unwilling to give her more reassurance than I actually had. When we returned to the room, the main course had been cleared, and people were beginning to move around between tables. Emily was talking with Daniel's mother. Rebecca walked toward them. But before she reached the table, Emily stood and asked one of her bridesmaids to come outside with her. Rebecca stopped, and the small rejection was probably invisible to everyone except the two of us. A week earlier, Emily would have called for her mother. That night, she chose someone else. At 7:15, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I stepped away from the table and saw Helen's name. For a moment, I expected a message telling me she was outside. Instead, she wrote, "I'm staying home tonight, and I won't come tomorrow either. I hope Emily has a good wedding." She did not apologize for making me wonder whether she would show up, and I did not think she owed me one. She had been asked to absorb a betrayal while the people involved continued with the family celebration. Staying away cost her something too. I replied, "Thank you, I mean it," and left it there. When I returned to the table, Rebecca knew from my face that something had changed. Rebecca asked whether the message was from Helen. I nodded and told her Helen was not coming. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. The relief on her face was immediate, and she seemed ashamed of it almost as quickly. "She made the right decision," Rebecca said. "Helen made a generous decision. I would not confuse the two." Rebecca did not answer. The dinner ended a little after 9 without a confrontation or any public explanation for why two longtime family friends had disappeared from the weekend. Emily hugged guests at the door and thanked people for coming. When Rebecca tried to help her gather some of the gifts and cards, Emily let her. But the conversation between them stayed practical. Before Daniel and Emily left, I asked my daughter if she was all right. "I don't know," she said, "but I'm getting married tomorrow. That is still allowed." She almost smiled. Then she glanced toward Rebecca, who was talking to my sister across the room. Emily said she hated that everyone thought everything was normal, but she also did not want them to know why it wasn't. "You do not owe anyone an explanation tomorrow." She nodded. Rebecca and I drove home separately because she had ridden to the restaurant with one of the bridesmaids earlier in the day. I was grateful for the empty car. The rehearsal dinner had ended without the public confrontation Rebecca feared, or the one Helen had briefly considered. Nothing between Rebecca and me was better because of it. Emily had simply reached the night before her wedding without our marriage taking over the room. Saturday morning began before sunrise for Rebecca and hours later for me. She left early to meet Emily and the bridal party at the venue. I stayed home long enough to shower, drink coffee, and make sure the last printed pieces from my shop were loaded into the SUV. By 11:30, I was driving south of Franklin, toward the estate where Emily and Daniel were getting married. The venue sat beyond a long tree-lined drive, with a restored house, a lawn set up for the ceremony, and a reception building farther down the property. Cars were already filling the gravel parking area. I carried in the framed seating display and found Daniel near the reception hall. He looked tired but happy. "Tom has not contacted us again," he said quietly after we moved away from the staff. "Good. The coordinator knows he is not on the list. I told her there is no need to make it a security thing unless he actually shows up." "That sounds right." Daniel looked toward the house where the bridal party was getting ready and asked how Rebecca was doing. "I don't know." His expression told me he understood the answer was about more than her mood, so we left it there. For the next hour, I did normal father of the bride work. I moved a box that had been left in the wrong building, answered a question about an elderly relative's transportation, and found the envelope containing the final vendor checks. Those tasks were a relief because each one had an answer. Around 1, I went into the main house to see Emily. The bridal suite was crowded with bridesmaids, garment bags, makeup cases, flowers, and half-finished cups of coffee. Rebecca stood near the window with a small jewelry box in her hand. Emily was already in her dress. For 1 second, everything else disappeared. She looked like my daughter, and also like someone who had become an adult while I was not paying attention. Rebecca opened the jewelry box. "I have Grandma's earrings if you still want them." Emily looked at the earrings and said she did. Rebecca stepped closer, as if she was going to help put them on. Emily's maid of honor, Sarah, was already beside her. "I've got it, Mom," Emily said. "Can you check whether the bouquets came up from downstairs?" The request was gentle. Rebecca paused, then handed the box to Sarah. Of course. She left the room without looking at me. Emily watched the door close. "I feel horrible doing that. You asked her to check on flowers. You did not throw her out." "That is not what I mean." I waited while Emily looked at herself in the mirror. "I don't know how I'm supposed to act around her today. If I let her help me, I feel like I'm pretending. Then, I feel like I'm punishing her during my own wedding. You do not have to turn every small decision into a verdict on your relationship with your mother." She looked at me through the mirror. "That sounds like something you have been telling yourself." "It probably is." That earned a real smile, although it lasted only a second. I told her she was allowed to let Rebecca help with one thing and not another. She did not have to decide what their relationship would look like 6 months from now while somebody was trying to fix her hair. Emily nodded before asking, "Are you okay?" I had been expecting that question since Wednesday. "I will be." Emily pointed out that it was not much of an answer. "It is the answer I have today." She turned away from the mirror to face me. "I know you kept this private. Daniel's parents still don't know, and Sarah is the only bridesmaid I told because I needed somebody with me this morning. That is fine. Thank you. You do not need to thank me for not making your wedding about my marriage. I know, but you could have." She was right. Anger gives you 1,000 ways to justify making other people carry it. I had thought about what it would feel like if everyone in that room knew what Rebecca had done. I had imagined the shame on her face. None of those images made Emily's wedding better. I asked whether she wanted to talk about her mother, and Emily said she did not want to do that today. "Then you don't have to." After a breath, she asked about Rebecca and me. "That can wait too," I said. A bridesmaid called from the doorway that the photographer was ready for family pictures. Rebecca returned a few minutes later with the bouquets. She and Emily spoke normally enough to get through the photographs. There was one picture of Rebecca adjusting the edge of Emily's veil. Emily let her do it. I saw how carefully Rebecca handled the fabric, and how quickly she stepped away when she finished. The photograph captured both the love between them and the damage without resolving either one. About 20 minutes before the ceremony, the coordinator came looking for me. "It is almost time for the processional." I found Emily alone for a moment in the hallway. She slipped her arm through mine. "You ready?" "No," she said, "but apparently that is not required." I laughed. Outside, the music changed and the wedding party began moving toward the lawn. Whatever happened to my marriage after that day, the next few minutes belonged to my daughter. We stepped toward the doors together. The ceremony lasted 26 minutes. I only know the exact length because I later saw the timestamp on the wedding video. At the time, it felt both much shorter and much longer. I walked Emily down the aisle, shook Daniel's hand, hugged my daughter, and took my seat beside Rebecca. She was crying before the officiant finished the opening remarks. I could not tell how much of Rebecca's emotion came from the wedding, and how much came from everything surrounding it. And she probably could not either. When Emily and Daniel exchanged vows, I watched them instead of Rebecca. It would have been easy to turn their promises about honesty into a private argument with my wife. But those vows belonged to Emily and Daniel, not to us. When the ceremony ended, everyone stood and applauded. For the first time since Wednesday morning, I felt something close to relief. Emily was married. Tom had stayed away. Helen had chosen not to come, and no relative had been pulled aside and told the story. The ceremony had belonged to Emily and Daniel instead of becoming a referendum on Rebecca and me. At the reception, the photographer moved through the family pictures quickly. Rebecca and I stood together when asked. We smiled when the camera was pointed at us. I did not put my arm around her unless the photographer specifically needed us closer for a group shot, and Rebecca did not ask me to. There was an awkwardness between us, but it was subtle enough that anyone who noticed could reasonably blame wedding stress. One of Tom's friends asked me during cocktail hour whether the Mercers were all right. I gave him the same vague explanation about a family problem, and he wished them well before walking away. I hated how easily a sentence could hide something enormous. I reminded myself that Emily had asked for privacy. From across the reception hall, that might look like I was protecting Rebecca from embarrassment. But the person whose wishes mattered in that moment was my daughter. Dinner gave way to drinks and music, and eventually it was time for the parent speeches. I stood with a glass in my hand and looked at Emily and Daniel. I had written my remarks 2 weeks earlier. For about 5 seconds that afternoon, I had considered changing them. There were lines in the original speech about commitment, patience, and learning to build a life together. Suddenly, every sentence sounded as if it could be interpreted as a message to Rebecca, so I cut most of that before the reception began. I talked instead about Emily at 8 years old, trying to run a lemonade stand with a handwritten expense sheet, and about the first time Daniel came to our house and insisted on helping me carry boxes from the garage. I finished by telling them how happy I was that my daughter had found someone who made ordinary life feel like something she wanted to share. I kept betrayal, second chances, and Rebecca entirely out of the speech. When I finished, Emily hugged me hard. Emily whispered that the speech had been good. I told her I had a good subject, and then the reception moved on around us. Rebecca gave her own short toast later with Daniel's mother. She kept it focused on the couple too. Whatever else I believed about her choices, she did not use the microphone to explain herself or ask for sympathy. As the evening went on, I saw the price of the week show itself in smaller ways. Emily still danced with Rebecca during a group song, but she spent more time with Daniel's mother and her bridesmaids than she normally would have. When the photographer asked for an informal mother-daughter picture near the garden, Emily agreed. But the pose ended quickly. Later, when Emily changed shoes before the final hour of the reception, Rebecca brought them over and offered to help. "I've got it, Mom." Rebecca simply nodded and handed them to her without arguing. Near the end of the night, Emily hugged Rebecca without turning it into a declaration of forgiveness or reconciliation. She simply held her mother for several seconds, and Rebecca closed her eyes. When they separated, both of them were crying. I looked away because the moment was theirs. Daniel and Emily left under a line of sparklers shortly before 11. Rebecca and I stayed behind long enough to help gather cards, gifts, and a few personal items from the bridal suite. By then we were exhausted. At the parking lot, Rebecca stood beside her car and looked back toward the reception building. Rebecca said quietly that Emily had gotten the wedding she wanted, and then added, "I really did want that for her." I know. Rebecca looked surprised that I believed her. I could believe Rebecca had genuinely wanted a beautiful wedding for Emily, without believing that everything she had done in the name of protecting it was selfless. When she asked whether I was coming home, I told her I was, but that whatever we needed to decide about our marriage could wait until the wedding day was actually over. She nodded, and we drove home in separate cars. Sunday morning, I woke later than usual and found Rebecca in the kitchen with coffee and her phone face down on the table. I poured a cup and sat across from her. When the phone buzzed, she looked at the screen but did not pick it up. I asked if it was Tom, and she nodded. "He has been calling since 7. I waited until Rebecca finally turned the phone over and slid it away from herself. "He says Saturday is over." I knew what that meant before she finished. He wants to know what I'm doing now. The wedding had been the reason Rebecca gave everyone for waiting. Now the wedding was over. For the first time in 10 months, she had nowhere left to move the decision. Rebecca did not answer Tom's call while I was sitting at the kitchen table. The phone stopped buzzing, and for a few minutes neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "I told him I needed time." I reminded her that she had been telling him that for 10 months, then asked what he believed she had promised. "I never promised I would leave you." "I know. What did you let him believe?" She stared at the coffee in front of her. "I kept saying I would make a decision after Emily's wedding. He heard that as me saying I would choose him." "And what did you mean?" "That after the wedding I would finally have to decide." There was the whole problem in one sentence. Tom had heard a promise where Rebecca had meant a postponement, and for months she had allowed that difference to work in her favor. Her phone buzzed again. This time she picked it up and walked into the living room. I stayed where I was. I could hear her voice, but not every word. At first, she spoke quietly. Then her tone sharpened as she told Tom she had never made the promise he was accusing her of making. After another stretch of listening, she said, "Tom, I am not doing this right now." She came back into the kitchen 10 minutes later, looking angry. "He says I made him look like an idiot." I almost asked whether sitting at our daughter's wedding beside Helen would have made him look smarter. But there was no point. When I asked what Tom wanted, Rebecca said he expected her to leave. Today, he says I have had months to think about it. That part was difficult to argue with. Rebecca leaned against the counter. I told him I cannot walk out of a 29-year marriage the morning after our daughter gets married. I looked at her. You were able to have a 10-month affair during it. She flinched and said she knew. I don't think you understand that part yet, I said, and left the kitchen before we circled the same argument again. For the rest of Sunday, Rebecca and I stayed in different parts of the house. On Monday morning, I went back to the print shop. The building looked exactly the same as it had on Wednesday when Helen called me. The same paper cutter was running. And the seating display proof I had been checking that morning was still clipped to the board beside my desk. The difference was that there was no rehearsal dinner left to protect, no ceremony hours away, and no guest list decision waiting on us. I could finally ask what I wanted without measuring every answer against Saturday. Rebecca texted around noon and asked whether we could talk that evening. I agreed. When I got home, she told me she had spoken to Tom twice more. Rebecca said Tom kept accusing her of using the wedding to keep him waiting. When I asked whether he was right, she said she had never thought of it that way. That answer was different from no. She sat across from me at the dining table, the same place where she had admitted the affair 5 nights earlier. I kept telling myself I could not make any life-changing decision while Emily was planning her wedding. Then it became 3 months away, then 6 weeks, then 2 weeks. Every time I got close to having to decide, there was another reason not to. Meanwhile, you still had both lives. Rebecca closed her eyes and admitted that I was right. It was the first time she said it without arguing with the wording. She told me Tom had accused her of misleading him about what would happen once the wedding was over. Rebecca insisted she had never said she would definitely leave me. I believe you, I said. She looked surprised. I also believe you knew he thought there was a real chance you would. She did not deny it. 2 days later, Helen called me. We had not spoken since Thursday. Our only contact after that had been her brief text during the rehearsal dinner. She said Tom had moved into a hotel after another round of fighting that took up most of Sunday and Monday. I'm not calling to dump more proof on you, she said. I just thought you should know, he keeps saying. Rebecca told him she would make a decision after the wedding. I told Helen that Rebecca had given me the same version. He heard it as a promise, Helen said. So did I, at first. I think Rebecca meant not yet, while Tom heard after Saturday. Helen was quiet for a moment. That sounds like Tom. There was no satisfaction in her voice when I asked what she planned to do next. I told him not to come home for now. I have an attorney appointment next week. I left the legal details with her. Before we ended the call, Helen apologized for how close she had come to confronting Rebecca at the rehearsal dinner. I reminded her that she had stayed away when it mattered. She admitted that she had been furious Rebecca still got to be there. I told her I understood. After a pause, Helen said, Emily did not deserve any of it. No, she didn't. That was the last conversation we had for several months. By Thursday, Tom's calls to Rebecca had slowed. She told me they were arguing more than they were talking. He wanted a clear answer about their future. Rebecca kept telling him she could not go directly from a wedding weekend into leaving her marriage for him. By then, even Rebecca could see the contradiction. She had spent months treating the wedding as the reason she could not choose, only to discover afterward that she still did not want the life Tom thought was waiting for them. Rebecca ended the affair the following weekend. She met Tom at a public coffee shop on Sunday afternoon and came home afterward to tell me it was over. He thinks I lied to him, she said. Did you? About us being over. Number about how ready I was to leave. Probably. That answer was more honest than most of what she had given me during the previous year. She said Tom believed she had spent months building toward a future with him. Rebecca had believed she was postponing a decision until a better time. Neither version made what they had done less damaging. Rebecca sat down across from me. I told him I am not leaving you to be with him. I waited. She looked at me for a long time. I want to try to save our marriage. I had expected the question, but hearing it still landed harder than I thought it would. Rebecca said she wanted counseling. She offered to answer whatever questions I had, keep Tom out of her life, and accept that rebuilding trust could take years. I know 29 years does not excuse 10 months, she said. But I also do not know how to look at 29 years and say none of it matters anymore. I am not saying none of it matter. Then why does this have to end everything? I took a while before answering, because a clean-sounding sentence would have explained less than the truth. The affair is enough reason by itself, I said. But that is not the part I keep coming back to. She waited while I tried to put the rest into words. For months, every time the wedding got closer, you used it as the reason nothing could change. You knew I would do the same thing if I found out. You knew I would not want Emily's wedding turned into a family disaster. I was trying to protect her too. I believe you. She stopped arguing, so I continued. I believe you wanted Emily to have a good wedding. I believe you loved helping her plan it. I also believe you understood that my love for her made this week safer for you. Rebecca started crying. I did not sit there and calculate it like that. I know, that does not make it less true. She wiped her face. I thought if I could just get through the wedding, I would have time to fix everything. Which everything? She did not answer. That is the problem. Tom was waiting for you to choose him. I thought I was in a normal marriage that had grown a little distant, and Emily believed you when you said you were helping with the wedding. You were the only person who could see all three versions at once. Rebecca looked down. I told her I had spent most of our marriage believing one of my jobs was to keep family problems from landing on Emily at the worst possible moment. Rebecca knew that because she had seen me do it for years. When she began the affair, she had not simply lied about Tom. She had continued making decisions while assuming I would keep playing the stabilizing role if anything went wrong. You were able to delay choosing because you trusted me to hold everything steady without even knowing what I was holding. Rebecca covered her mouth and sat without speaking for several seconds before finally saying, I am sorry. This time I believed she understood more of what she was apologizing for. That still did not make me want to stay. She asked whether I could at least try counseling before deciding. I told her I would consider counseling if it helped us separate without turning the next year into a war. I was not willing to treat it as a test for whether the marriage could still be saved. Rebecca stared at me and asked whether I had already decided the marriage was over. Yes, she asked when, and I had to think about it. The decision had been forming since Wednesday, but I think I knew by the time you admitted using Emily's name as cover. I just was not going to make it permanent while I was still trying to get her through Saturday. Rebecca gave a small, painful laugh. So you waited too. I did. The difference is I knew I was waiting. She looked away. We talked for another hour in low voices, without turning the conversation into a tally of everything Rebecca had lost. She told me she had been unhappy, lonely, and afraid that the best part of her life was behind her. Tom made her feel wanted and less predictable. She admitted she had mistaken being desired in secret for evidence that another life would be better. I could understand how someone reached that point without accepting what she did after she got there. Before we went to bed, Rebecca asked one more time whether I was sure. I am sure I do not want to spend the next few years wondering whether every quiet period in our marriage is real or just another thing you are waiting to deal with later. She nodded. The following week, I met with a family attorney. Rebecca did the same soon after. The public moments had all passed by then. Our marriage ended at the dining table, after the wedding was over, and there was finally nothing left to postpone. The divorce took most of the next year. After 29 years, there was no clean way to separate our finances quickly. Grant Print and Graphics had value even though it was not a company anyone was going to sell overnight. Rebecca's real estate income changed from year to year. We had retirement accounts, a house, vehicles, savings, and a long history of paying for things together. We used attorneys and a financial professional to work through it, but not about whether Rebecca deserved to be left with nothing or whether I deserved to keep every dollar because she had cheated. Neither of us got that kind of ending. I kept the print company. Doing that required the business to be valued and other parts of the settlement to be arranged around it. Rebecca kept her real estate business and eventually moved into a townhouse a few miles from where Emily and Daniel lived. We eventually sold the house, which was harder for me than the financial paperwork. Rebecca and I had bought it when Emily was still in school. The garage had held her first car, graduation decorations, boxes from college, and eventually wedding supplies. By the time the last room was empty, I understood that a place could contain a good family history, even if the marriage attached to it did not survive. Tom and Helen remained separated after the week of the wedding. Helen had told me about the initial split herself, but I learned most of what happened after that through other people. Different friends knew different amounts, and over the following months their longtime social circle gradually stopped treating them as a couple. Tom never called me again, although Rebecca told me he contacted her several weeks after their final meeting and asked whether they had ended things only because everything became public. She said no. By then, whatever that answer did to him was no longer something I needed to manage. Helen called me once, about 6 months after the wedding. She had moved into a smaller place and was still working through her own divorce. We spoke for less than 10 minutes. We never turned that shared disaster into a friendship. We had needed information from each other during one terrible week, and that was enough. "I hope things get easier," she said. I wished her the same, and eventually they did. Emily's relationship with Rebecca was more complicated, but she did not cut her mother off. At first, their calls were shorter and less frequent. Emily told me there were days when she wanted to ask Rebecca every possible question, and other days when she did not want to hear the word Tom at all. I stayed out of that relationship as much as I could. Emily's anger belonged to her, and so did any lunch or phone call she chose to have with her mother. Rebecca had hurt our daughter, but she was still her mother. Several months after the wedding, Emily told me she and Rebecca had started seeing each other more regularly again. She said things still did not feel normal, but she could tell her mother was trying. "I think she is too," I said. Emily looked at me carefully, as if she expected that answer to bother me. It did not. Rebecca could become a better mother to our adult daughter without becoming my wife again. I no longer needed those two relationships to produce the same answer. My own life became quieter after I rented a place closer to the print shop. During the first few months, I spent more evenings there than I probably needed to, because work was familiar, and familiar things were useful. The rest of the adjustment happened in smaller ways. I got used to making plans that did not require checking with another person first, and eventually that started to feel ordinary. About 8 months after the wedding, Emily sent me a link to the final folder of photographs from the photographer. I had seen some of them already, but not all. That evening I sat at my kitchen table and went through them. There were pictures from the rehearsal dinner, the bridal suite, the ceremony, the reception, and the sparkler exit. Then I found one of Emily and me just before we walked down the aisle. She had her arm through mine. I was looking at her instead of the camera. If you did not know what had happened that week, there was nothing unusual in the photograph. Helen's call, Tom's missing invitation, and the collapse of my trust in Rebecca were all outside the frame. What the picture showed was simply a father standing beside his daughter before her wedding. A few weeks after the ceremony, Emily had told me she was grateful I had not turned the reception into a public reckoning. At the time, I told her there was nothing to thank me for. Looking at the photograph months later, I understood the choice more clearly. Rebecca had been right that Emily deserved a wedding that was not consumed by our marriage. Where she had gone wrong was assuming that protecting Emily also required keeping the secret that made the week dangerous in the first place. I had told our daughter enough to let her decide who belonged at her wedding, then kept the rest of the damage away from the reception hall. Looking at the two of us in that photograph, I knew I had protected Emily's day without helping Rebecca keep the lie alive. For 3 days, those obligations had seemed almost impossible to separate. But they had never been the same thing. If you enjoy stories where betrayal finally meets consequences, subscribe for the next one. This is Blood Never Lies.